Hi, guys. Welcome back to Having a Ball podcast. I am your host, Erica.
And I'm Lucy.
And today we're doing another one of these Having a Ball podcast presents Hollywood Mysteries, which we've done one before, but this is our second one. And I hope you guys enjoy it.
Today we are talking about Bob Crane. And I want to say that to anyone listening, if you're listening with children, you should probably turn off the episode now. There's a lot of things that your children don't need to be hearing. So with that, let's dive into the world of Bob Crane. I want to start off by saying that I love Bob Crane.
Yeah, this was your idea to do this story.
This is my idea.
Yeah, it was one of those, we did George Reeves earlier, which was my idea. This one's yours. And I didn't know anything about Bob Crane, but once I, dove in.
Oh my goodness. Mm-hmm. It's just like never ending, right? You just find out so much. Mm-hmm. So let's start with his early life. He was born July 13th, 1928 in Waterbury, Connecticut. He had a brother named Alfred John, and his parents were Alfred Thomas. Then his mom was Rosemary Crane.
He was born on Friday the 13th.
Was he?
Fun fact.
Ooh. Okay, between 1929 and 1942, his family moved 8 different times to 8 different residences. So 1929, they moved to Stanford. 1936, they were in Poughkeepsie, New York, Connecticut, by the way. 1938, they moved back to Stamford, Connecticut. And then from then to 1942, they moved the rest of the times like to different houses. So I have to say that that's got to be kind of,
like it's just unstable.
Yeah, definitely unstable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just a lot of moving. Thankfully, they stayed in Stamford mostly. So when he was in school, he was able to stay in those schools.
And that's really where his he started doing the drums when he was about 11 years old is when he really acquired or actually, gave more love to the craft at age 11. And by junior high, he was already organizing local drum and bugle parades with his neighborhood friends. Now that kind of reminds us of the, Keith Thibodeau story where they're children, just these prodigies learning the skill of drumming. Which
he got it when he was 10 years old for Christmas. It was purchased. So his dad purchased it from a store. He purchased an original drum for $23 from a local shopkeeper, Vito. But for some reason, it was sold out for him. So his father, Bob's father, asked, can you save this until Christmas? I'll come pick it up and then he'll have it. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, it was sold out for him under him. So being like just furious, Bob Crane's father went in and he stole a $75 drum and walked out of the store with it.
Oh, wow.
And Vito didn't say anything because he was a pretty stand-up guy. So he knew he'd come back, he'd make it right. Mm-hmm. And he did. But for that time being, he just took it and he went because he was so mad. And when Bob Crane would become Colonel Hogan in Hogan's Heroes, he had this photo of him. And underneath it said, I, Vito, am responsible for the show business career of Bob Crane, star of TV, radio, and movies, which is a little bit bold.
Yeah.
But yes. And so what you were saying was that, so he started drumming. It was his outlet. It was his escape. His father someone described him as a taskmaster. Mm-hmm. Like he's just very strict. They grew up in a very strict Catholic household. And so it was his outlet, and he was very popular. So he organized a lot of, like you said, parades, baseball, sports groups, I guess, teams. And actually in one of the teams that he started called the Belton Braves, it was a baseball team. That's when he met his first wife, Annie Terzian. He was 14. And so I guess when they were playing, ran into him with his bike. He says, I was playing second base for the baseball team and she was riding her bicycle and bumped into me, and boy, did I fall for her. Pun intended, right? And this relationship, I mean, everyone said that they knew that they were meant to be together.
Okay.
They were, from that moment on, they were inseparable. They were kind of like joined at the hip.
Yeah. And they went on to marry in 1949. But that was, I think we skipped his high school years, but also that's when he did, he was part of the Connecticut and Norwalk Symphony Orchestra. It's part of a youth orchestra program, and graduated Stanford High School in 1946. And then he also enlisted for 2 years in the Connecticut Army in 1948, but was honorably discharged in 1950.
Yes. So when he was in high school, him and his friend Edwin went to Tin Pan Alley. If no one knows what that is, that's an area between 48th and 52nd Street. It's very famous for local musicians. They would hang out there between stage time. And they went down there, they took the train, and they got to see Benny Goodman. But apparently, Benny Goodman didn't want anything to do with him. So they saw him and they walked up to him and tried to talk to him. Benny Goodman just walked away. And they think it's because there were like 5 other musicians there, and they didn't want it to seem like he didn't want to speak to them. But the other 5 people were very, very nice. And they directed Bob towards Adler Drum Studio. And that's where he started taking lessons from Cozy Cole. And he traveled into Manhattan at least once a week by train. Now, I don't know how far Stamford, Connecticut to Manhattan is, but I mean, it's still a big jump.
And so young.
Edwin he became a professional musician, and he would mention that Bob was a very flashy drummer. And compared to professional musicians, he wasn't that good. He was a very good musical entertainer. And what he said was that he was fun. He was fun to listen to, and he was fun to watch. And now you also mentioned that he played in the Connecticut Symphony Orchestra and the Norwalk Symphony Orchestra. He played in both of those from 1944 to 1946. It has been rumored that he was asked to leave the Connecticut Symphony Orchestra for putting in jazz touches to a Bach fugue. It's very hard to know if that's true, because Bob Crane made up stories to make people laugh. It's what you do in radio, right?
Yes, of course.
He even made up a story that he didn't graduate from high school. That rumor started with him. And when we get to the part of his murder, you'll see how that became very problematic, because people took that as word, and he did graduate high school.
And in 1946.
When they were in high school, World War II was in full swing, guys. It was 1946. Bob was 15, and his brother joined the Navy. On May 11th, 1945, his brother was supporting the Okinawa invasion, and his carrier was attacked. 340 men were killed, 43 were missing, and 264 were wounded. Now, because they didn't you can't just jump on a phone or text someone and say, hey, I survived this. Everyone was very worried. For 3 weeks, they had to wait to know if he survived. And his high school was preparing to graduate Bob and a lot of his classmates because of the draft. Okay. So the report day was May 20th, 1945. Victory in Europe happened May 8th, 1945. So the draft ended, allowing them to continue high school instead of joining the military. But do you see how close those dates were? I mean, they were ready. They were like preparing to join the military.
Yeah.
June 5th, 1946, you mentioned he graduated high school. Before he joined the Stanford National Guard, he started at a jewelry store. That was his first job after high school. He hated it. The only reason he worked there was to wait until Annie had graduated from high school. He actually turned down an offer to take over the store when the owner passed away, because the owner didn't have any sons, any children. And so, he was like, Bob, I really like you.
Like, no thanks.
He was like, no. And Bob's father got very, very mad. He was like, radio isn't gonna make him any money. This is not gonna happen. And we'll see. That is very, very wrong. In June of 1948, Bob proposed to Anne. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no. You're fine.
You look like you were about to say something.
No. I actually have that next thing of them being married in 1949. Then we jump into his career, his radio career beginning in 1950, which was radio broadcasting at WLEA in Hornell, New York. Then he moved to the Connecticut stations WBIS in Bristol, and then WICC in Bridgeport. Now, they were sort of not wanting him there because they were taking a lot of the listeners from the New York station. See, when I first started looking into this, I wasn't sure when they said radio career, because that could be a vast number of things. You could be doing newscasting, plays, music, all that sort of stuff. But I wasn't sure where he fit into this. But then I start listening to some of the broadcasts that they played on YouTube, and it was literally that, doing the drums, kind of putting on small skits, things like that. This is just the ones that we're talking about in Connecticut.
Well, first of all, Bob he had radio on his mind for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
He would perform in his bedroom at like 12 years old. He'd sit behind the drums and he'd introduce the songs on his radio, like his turntable. And then he'd play along to the song. And that's how he kind of started developing his skills. And while he was working at the jewelry store, he was sending out lots of different like audio
mm-hmm.
and applications. And in 1950, that is when he heard from WLEA in Hornell, New York. And they said that they were looking for an on-air announcer. He was having trouble with his wife, Annie. Actually, they were having marital disputes.
Oh, and that started early. The marital disputes started early.
They almost got divorced. Well, they almost got divorced in the first year of their marriage. And then they worked it out. And we'll talk more about that
mm-hmm.
when we get there. But he headed to Hornell. And when he got there, after his car broke down and he literally hitchhiked his way in on the back of like a farmer's truck, he was offered a job as the maintenance man. And he took it. We need you to do this job if you're willing. So he took it. And he was one out of 50 applicants to interview. And he was the only one who got offered the job because all 49 others were from New York. And Hornell was worried that their small time little radio station wasn't going to be good enough for them.
Okay.
Within a month of working at WLEA, he was promoted to program director. And he worked at WLEA from March through December of 1950. And so this is where we could talk a little bit about, at this time, this is where that divorce was really starting to come into play, because Bob was seeing a woman in Hornell. And Annie was having a hard time feeling connected because they were very far away.
Mm-hmm.
And he was with her terminally ill father. But in 1950 December, WBIS in Bristol, Connecticut, sent Bob an offer to work for them, and he accepted, which meant that he was able to come home. They still weren't, right next to each other, but he was able to see her on the weekends, which really helped with their with their marriage. And he got paid $5 more. At this time, they weren't making very much money, and they were having some troubles financially as well. After he started at WBIS, he got an offer from WLIZ in Bridgeport, and he left WBIS after only 3 months. So in April of 1950, he began a 5-year stint in southwestern Connecticut. I mean, that was really, really good for them. And in June 27th, 1951, Annie gave birth to their first son, Robert David Crane,
mm-hmm.
who they'd call Bobby Jr. 1952, WLIZ was taken over by WICC. Bob was one of the only original staff to be kept up by WICC. And he was, by March of 1953, he was the operating director. Some of you guys might wonder why I'm like pushing all of this information about him. And I think it's because he was amazing at radio hosting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as we see it, he gets them views that they weren't expecting, and he puts in so much work. So as he's working, April 25th in 1953, WICC, they moved next to channel 43. And this gave Bob his first chance to get in front of the camera. He really, really wanted channel 43 to work, to make it.
Yeah.
And it didn't. But he was the chief video engineer. He had several television shows live over channel 43, and he didn't receive any extra income for it. He just did it because he loved it.
Mm-hmm. The experience, the
mm-hmm.
ability to jump into that. Yeah, he very much wanted to have, well, this goes later to when he started on the show, but he really wanted to be sort of a Jack Lemmon, Jack Benny type. And so that's probably where he wanted to migrate his passion to, from radio to the television.
At that time in 1956, were so much. He had increased them so much that he was making $500 a week. And that is when we get
KNX.
And I think you were talking KNX. Yep.
Yes.
I'm looking right at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason this station stands
yeah.
out to me is because it's a station out here in Los Angeles. It's one of two. I'm a huge talk radio fan. I've been since I was a teenager. I've loved talk news radio. And so there's only two, not only two, but two large talk radio stations out here in LA, one of them being KFI 640 and KNX 1070, which was a different dial, I think, when Bob Crane was on there, but that's why that stood out to me. But this was in 1956 is when they sent him over to do the program over on KNX. Do you have a little more information of his travels there or here?
Wanted him because they were worried. CBS was worried that they were getting too many listeners and that KNX wasn't getting enough because of Bob Crane's show over on WICC. Mm-hmm. And so they were trying to get him over, and they worked really hard. At first, he didn't want to take the job because he wasn't going to be able to direct it as much as he could at WICC. Mm-hmm. So basically, he was like, I can come, but you have to let me run the show my own way. And then when he got there, he did so well that in 1958, they added a component to the Bob Crane show, which is what his XNX radio show was the Bob Crane show.
Or KNX.
Yep.
KNX. It's right there.
It's right in front of me.
Yeah.
So what he would do was he would
interview. Yeah.
He would interview live celebrities.
Yeah.
There is a ginormous. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a few if you want to hear them, but not 3,000 guys. Julie Andrews, Ray Charles, Doris Day, Jimmy Durant, W.C. Fields, Tennessee Ernie Ford, which, if you remember that name, is on Lucille Ball. And her shows, Andy Griffith, Bob Hope, Rock Hudson, Gypsy Rose Lee, Jack Lemmon, Mary Tyler Moore, Wayne Newton, Donna Reed, Red Skelton, Lawrence Welk, Jonathan Winters, and Natalie Wood. That's just a few.
I have Ronald Reagan and Marilyn Monroe, Dick Van Dyke. Yeah, it's
so many people.
So many people.
Around this time, 1958, it was November 21st, 1958. Around then, that's when Tunnel of Love came out. Mm-hmm. And they went to go see it in theaters. And Annie said at the end of the movie, she was like, I just spent 90 minutes watching you. And this is when Bob really started thinking about becoming an actor. June 19th, 1959, Annie gave birth to a daughter. It's one of two that he has with Annie. Her name is Deborah Ann. And then September 1959, he started working with the Valley Playhouse. And he actually put on a production of Tunnel of Love in which he appeared. November 29th, 1960, Karen Leslie was born. That's the second of their daughters.
Okay.
In the fall of 1960, he was in another play called Who Was That Lady?, which was apparently very, very funny. Now, you may be wondering if he wanted to be in movies so much, why he was just doing plays. CBS actually correctly assumed that Bob would want to move to acting when he moved out to California. And so they put a no acting clause in his in the
contract.
Yep. And basically he could not professionally act until 1961. That's when the end of his first contract with KNX happened. But despite this clause, Bob Crane actually filmed a short for a pilot on a television series called Picture Window, and it didn't get picked up, which might be why he didn't get in trouble with KNX.
Okay, so he had a no acting clause in his contract.
Correct, which meant that he could not act until 1961 professionally. That's why he stayed in local shows. But in 1961, KNX's contract was done, and he started doing 1-year contracts with them. But he also made sure that he was allowed to
do like TV
act.
Appearances and
he was like, I won't sign it if you don't let me act. And so in 1961, he actually briefly appeared in a film called Return to Peyton Place and in a film called Man Trap.
And he also did like a voice only on the Twilight Zone in 1961.
Oh.
Yeah. And then 1962, he did do the Dick Van Dyke Show too.
Somebody has to play Cleopatra, and
That's right.
that snowballed into the Donna Reed show.
Yes, he was Dr. Dave Kelsey
Mm-hmm.
on the Donna Reed show in
Yeah, this was
1963 to 65.
Yeah, so this was kind of weird. So in January 7th, 1963, it was only a few weeks after his appearance on the Dick Van Dyke show. Donna Reed show was like, we want you, but we want you for just a guest starring role as Dr. Dave Belvins in The Two Doctors Stone. So it wasn't even the same person. But then they liked him so much that they offered him a 7-year contract to play a new character, Dr. Dave Kelsey.
I see.
And at this point, he refused. He was like, I won't do 7 years. That's too long.
Yeah,
at the beginning of my career to just say, yep, 2 years to play the next door neighbor. He didn't want to play the next door neighbor character. He wanted to be a star.
Okay.
So he did decide to take a 2-year contract with them. And he worked alongside of Anne McCrea, and she was his wife. So during the 2 years, there was 2 years where he worked at KNX and the Donna Reed show together, and he earned an annual salary of $150,000.
That's a lot of money back then.
Yes, for those 2 years. And this show would help him get the Hogan's Heroes show. So in 1964, he actually took an acting course by Stella Adler, and this helped him kind of grow into a better actor, because right now he was just doing comedy, and he wanted to be able to do everything if he could, So when he left filming December 1st, 1964. Now here again, we have a lot of rumors, untrue facts. So there was one that suggested that he was fired, and one suggested that he quit because he wanted more money. Both of those are false. He just was bored and he wanted something else. And this is when he gets offered. December 22nd, 1964, Bob Crane read for the part of Robin Hogan in Hogan's Heroes. Now, you haven't watched Hogan's Heroes, right?
I have not. And I even prepping for this, I purposely avoided it just to kind of have the story of Bob Crane and not so much, what the show was about. But when I did see kind of the descriptor of it and, clips here and there, because I can't avoid it when I'm doing this, is I personally was not aware there was a laugh track involved. I mean, because of the subject matter, because of the premise of the show, I wasn't aware that it was that much of a comedy show. I did watch a few clips, and of course, the movie that we'll discuss later on also had kind of some reenactments of the show. I have an idea. It's nowhere near what I know of, like George Reeves, Superman, or I Love Lucy, that type of thing. But yeah, it's interesting watching it as a first timer.
Yes. So you hit on something that a lot of the people that came in to create the show were very concerned about. So Bob originally didn't want to do the show. He's very sensitive to what people went through during World War II. I mean, he even had friends, uncles, obviously his brother, that were in World War II. And he did not see how this could happen and be a comedy. But his co-star...
We have Werner Klemperer.
Yes, him. Okay. Yeah. He also was like, I'm not going to do this unless I am a complete idiot. He was like, I don't want, because he plays the commandant of a prisoner of war camp.
Okay.
And he was like, I don't want this commandant to be a hero. He needs to be stupid. It's the only way this is going to work.
You're mocking you're taking away the power from like an evil person or a harsh person and making it much more comedic.
Yes. So he did end up doing this. So he also worked for KNX from September 3rd, 1956 to August 16th, 1965. He tried to work both jobs fully, KNX and Hogan's Heroes, like he did with the Donna Reed show. And he realized like that's just too much because he's the starring man, right? He's one of the starring men on this show. And he was like, I can't keep doing that. In 1966, Bob Crane and Werner Klemperer went to Venezuela actually to promote the series. And one year, Bob made over 265 personal appearances to help promote Hogan's Heroes. So he really put...
He was never home.
No. And one of the things that's said about Bob Crane is that he was a workaholic, and he put everything behind whatever he was working on.
Yeah.
So you can see that with just all the personal appearances he did and the trips that he took. He just tried to really get through all of this. Now, a teeny bit on Hogan's Heroes, guys, because I might do a whole episode on my own, like one of those ones where I do an episode on just Hogan's Heroes. But it ran for 6 seasons from September 17th, 1965 through April 4th, 1971. It was nominated 3 times for Outstanding Comedy Series. Bob Crane was nominated twice for Outstanding Continued Performance by an Actor in a Leading Role in a Comedy Series. That's a mouthful. Nita Tabbitt was nominated once for Outstanding Performance by the Actress in a Supporting Role in a Comedy Series. And then Warner Klumperer was nominated consistently every year, each season, and he won twice for Outstanding Performance by an Actor in a Supporting Role in a Comedy Series.
And it ran for 6 seasons, right? The show total of 6 seasons?
Okay. 6 seasons. Okay. During this time, we kind of start to see a little bit more of Bob Crane's scandalous side come out. Bob Crane was having an affair with Cynthia Lynn from basically the start of the series. In January 1964 to the spring of 65, to the spring of 1966. Now, Cynthia Lynn played the commandant's secretary. And she'd leave. Her husband would find out that they were having this affair, and he would come back, basically demand that she give their love another shot. But Cynthia actually would say that this was like the worst mistake, leaving the show and leaving Bob Crane. Because at this time, again, Bob and Annie were looking at a divorce. Cynthia was separated from her husband, so they weren't together at the time. Bob and Cynthia were discussing marriage at the time, and Bob was actually very hurt when she left. But then, pretty soon after, Bob started having an affair with Patty Olson, who was Cynthia Lynn's replacement.
Right.
And at that point, Annie and him would divorce.
And he married her right away on the set. Patricia.
Yes. So 1970, Bob and Annie got divorced. And then you were correct. In October of 1970, Bob and Patty got married. In June of 1970, she became pregnant. And they had a son named Robert Scott Crane. Now, I was not able to find this to see if this was true. But Bob Crane's oldest son, Bobby, says that Robert Scott Crane is not Bob Crane's
biological son.
Okay. Because he had a vasectomy in 1968. Right. So it couldn't have been his. She was pregnant and they got married and it wasn't his. That's what they're saying. It could very well be true, but it didn't matter to Bob. It was his son. So Robert Scott Crane, who is the second Robert Scott Crane, when he was asked why he named his second child
the
Robert,
same name.
He was like, well, I just like that name. But no, he would go by Scott.
Went over, the reasons that obviously they got a divorce was because he could not remain faithful. This is the first wife, Annie. And what occurred there was, of course, he had already began what later on, became his doom, I guess, which was taking photographs of the women that he would, have these dalliances with. He would, take photographs and, keep them in albums and keep them in books and magazines and things like that. And so much so he became kind of clumsy with it, where he was careless. And so much so that his children would find these photographs and finally she would confront him with this. She, of course, knew about the girls that he was having affairs. This is the first wife affairs with that. And of course his co-star and things like that. But what we see later develop, if you will, with pictures and videos and things like that, started during his first marriage.
just so we're not going to beat around the bush, his sex addiction started back in high school, is when he started having troubles with women. It would then progress, as you mentioned, to taking photos. Now, I need to say this because I feel like people are going to hear, he took videos, he took photos. There are two things that I really need to say. One is that he took photos and videos of every aspect of his life. Hundreds of journals where he wrote every little detail down of his life. Mm-hmm. He would take home videos of just it didn't have to be an important occasion. It was just an occasion and he would take a video.
Right.
So this was, in his mind, just part of what he would do. It was part of who he was. It was like, if he was doing that with his life, it didn't seem different to do it with this part. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I need to make very clear is that from what all the records that they can see is that these were all consensual.
Yes.
The women always agreed. And if they didn't, it wouldn't happen. He never hid the cameras. They were always in plain sight.
Yeah. You can't hide these cameras in the 70s.
But it wasn't ever coerced. He would just say, this is what I do. And if they didn't, then it just wouldn't happen. So I need to point that out because I think that when you start looking at this, it becomes easy to villainize a person.
The salaciousness of it sounds like it would be something that you hear about today where there's a hidden camera in a wall. You're having these, private moments with somebody and suddenly it's recorded. You have to remember back in those days, there was no hiding it. There was no surveillance because, electronics like that were in its infancy and they were just starting to learn how to use this equipment, which later on
they had to be on like tripods and
big tripods, big
like that.
Cables galore. I mean, just there's no hiding it. It's like you walked into a movie production each time you're meeting with Bob, in a private moment. And like you mentioned, these are all adults. Number one, number two, women that were consenting and, probably starstruck, probably wouldn't have said yes to everybody, but, these were not coerced or kidnapped or, lied to or anything like that. But yeah, nonetheless,
they were adults.
And there was a lot of them
out there as well. Now, before we get into his more, or continue a little bit into the more scandalous side of his, I want to go through some of his volunteer work. Mm-hmm. Because he was also he would somehow, with everything that was going on, he found time to volunteer as well. So we discussed how this started with serving in the United States National Guard from 47 to 49. Mm-hmm. He would also then be part of the program advisor for the Bridgeport Junior Achievement when he was at WICC. He participated in other community events, like judging talent contests, serving as master of ceremonies for a bunch of organizations. At KNX, he participated in auxiliary lunches, club meetings, telethons. He acted as master of ceremonies to a bunch of organizations. He appeared at things like grocery department stores to help promote local events. He also held the title of honorary mayor of Tarzana, California, which is where he lived. He was a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and he was the Tarzana Senior Ambassador of Goodwill. While he worked in television, he continued his charity work with the U.S. Armed Forces Radio Network, Operating Entertainment, the Cystic Fibrosis Fund, the Easter Seals, the Arthritis Foundation, and the Rheumatism Foundation telethons. He hosted the United Cerebral Palsy telethon, and he had regular appearances from different MESA heroes and promoted the American Lung Association Christmas Seals program. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And he did this. Really at that time, he was doing this with, this wasn't something that he could post on social media and be like, look at me doing all this hard work. This was just out of the goodness of his heart. He just really liked helping people. With the exception of a very few people, Bob was very, very well liked to pretty much everyone. I mean, there are a few people that didn't like him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And professional to work with. We'll talk a little bit about when addiction started getting in the way of his work. Mm-hmm. That was at the very end of his career. But he did have this addiction. And so that's what we were talking about. So in 1963, This is kind of when his divorce was like falling apart. Anne was really ill and they were treating her with hepatitis. And they later found out that it was a tumor. It wasn't malignant and they were able to get it out. But it hurt their marriage even more.
Mm-hmm.
And living with, so we didn't mention this, but his mother-in-law lived with them. And that didn't help either. And then obviously the stepping out was did not help. What are your thoughts
on this of the lifestyle that he was, the double life really that he was
leading? It really was a double life because a lot of people didn't know this side of him. And you know, and they were shocked to find out.
There are some people that I think when you hear sex addiction, now I'm not a professional whatsoever. This is just my opinion based on hearing of, you know, such an addiction. You think to yourself, that's just an excuse for cheating, for having affairs, for, you know, having the ability and the temptation and falling to it or really looking for it. But when I read more of this, and there was an author that I was listening to John Cook, who wrote Who Killed Bob Crane, that it really was an addiction, because it wasn't like he was having an affair with a woman and then, you know, carried on for months and months. It was literally, if he could, with a different woman every day, he would, you know, he would go and play the drums after doing a whole shoot of Hogan's Heroes. He would play at the local strip clubs and, you know, and he would meet. That's a perfect place to meet when you have such an addiction, much like working at a bar if you have a drinking problem. And so that made it easy for him. And of course, because of his name and because of his stardom, it was easy for him to lead such a life, you know? And so to me, I think, unfortunately, it clouded a lot. Perhaps there was something in the childhood that you spoke of that he felt a need to sort of suppress, make up for. And I think if you listen to people who do have these sort of addictions, it stems from something that they're trying to numb, quiet, forget, something like that. Now, it slowly began to ruin his life. It ruined his marriage, certainly. And, you know, it certainly got in the way of his career, because there were times where he was in the middle of shooting something and he got distracted by a woman, a voluptuous woman. And that would, you know, he would make inappropriate comments in it. And it's like the professionalism would leave him for a minute because the addiction would kick in and he just kind of lost himself. So there's a lot of that. I did find
that the professionalism, there was like one specific point, because before that he was very, very professional.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I think it ramped up after a certain point.
Oh yeah. And I mean, right. That's what happens with addictions.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, in 1970s, addiction was not understood. Addicts, I mean, even now addicts are not understood, right? Yeah. And back then they definitely weren't understood. To be deemed an addict or to acknowledge that they were an addict was like the lowest point a person could reach. And so it was almost harder for them in their minds, right?
And then everyone else. Because whenever I was guilty of this myself, whenever you hear of someone saying they have it, you know, you accept drugs, alcohol, smoking as addictions, and you kind of like, well, that makes sense. But when you hear something as salacious as sex addiction, you kind of think, well, it's really just cheating or affairs. Right. Unless you're a single person, then you're just a person who likes to be with a bunch of people. But this, just when you listen to his story in particular, it very much comes across as an addiction, because it took over his life. Mm-hmm. And he lived by that. And it wasn't just for fun after work. It was something probably he couldn't wait to do.
He had to seek it out. He found out that he was typecast. From basically that moment on, yes. He was typecast as a Colonel, you know, Colonel Hogan. Mm-hmm. He tried to do a Hogan's Review. That was scheduled to run June 1st, 1971. It was like a play stage, but that was canceled. He did end up being in 2 Walt Disney film productions. He was in Superdad and he was in Gus. I have seen Gus. That's really good. He was offered a job on Family Feud. Don't know if you knew that, mm-hmm. But he didn't want to play the host. So he actually said, you know what, have Rich Dawson play it. And that made Richard Dawson a multi-millionaire. I mean, it shot him to stardom. And they tried to do like the Bob Crane show on TV. That failed. So basically he ended up going back to radio for a little bit to do some things. And he started working there, but then decided he didn't want to go back into it because people were really excited that he'd come back to radio. And he decided not to because he wanted to be in TV. Whenever he came back, it was as like a non-paid, like as a guest. So the incident you were talking about it happened when they were filming Hawaii Experience. This was in February of 1978. He agreed to host it was a half-hour television series. It was a reality show, basically. He was in a movie called The Love Boat, which was his one and only dramatic movie that he was in, which basically was like his life. If you've seen it, it's about a husband who's having affairs with a bunch of different people. And you see all of this happening and you see it. And so people are wondering, a lot of times people were just wondering like, okay, is that just where he was in his life? So he could do a really good job acting on it. That's that. And so was that when he married Patty, who during the time of his death, they would be discussing divorce at that time. But when he met Patty, she knew about his sex addiction and she was quite open with it. She was like, you can step out as long as you come home to me.
She was involved with him when he was married the first time. So she was very well aware of who he was. But so starting, this was in 1966 is when he first met John Carpenter, who, a little bit about him is he grew up in an Indian reservation, and he was portrayed somewhat of a loser depending on what you read or what you watch. I guess you can surmise something like that just based on what he where it ultimately ended, but you can't take away the knowledge that he had and give him that, which was the electronics. And that's he met a lot of celebrities through that. He worked for Sony. And he was the one who was teaching them how to work the equipment. That's how he came across meeting Bob Crane on the set. So they, struck up a friendship and they started going out all the time. Now, what Carpenter liked was the ability to attract women based on the celebrity of Bob Crane, because it was like flies, and so that would really be the only time that he was able to get this much attention really and live this lifestyle.
It was also said that he liked being with Bob Crane, and they suspected that he is a bisexual, and they suspected that he enjoyed being by Bob Crane because he had a secret crush on him. Crush seems, like a weird word, but you know what I mean? Like he just enjoyed being with him.
Right. There were times where he would sort of, I don't want to say act on it, but sort of hint at it or make certain, when they were involved with other women, he would sort of involve himself with Bob. So it was a little uncomfortable because from all indications, I don't think Bob was anything but straight.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't find anything that said he was otherwise. So.
And so they began, he would introduce himself as Bob's manager to kind of give himself a little more levitated title and impress more people. Now,
I sold him his cameras that are going to record you later. Oh.
Now that's, I mean, listen, this was the 60s where the lifestyle of drugs, sex, and rock and roll was like the thing, and now I think movies like this were starting to, be bigger and maybe not so much accepted, but really known. You get your Playboys and things like that. And perhaps they sold it as, a new medium of movies or something like that. Who knows? But the point is that they would meet various women, ask them if they could record them during their escapades, for lack of a better word. And they would acquire tons of it. Now, this took some work because it wasn't just like, like I mentioned, now we go on Amazon, buy a little camera, put it in the corner and just watch it on our app. They had to build a whole thing where you would connect it from the VHS tape to the camcorder, put it on the tripod. You got cables everywhere. I mean,
another way to show you guys, like, there's no way he was hiding this from the women. They were fully aware of what was going on.
Can you imagine, like, he brings a woman home or wherever he meets her, and it's like, hold on, let me set this up. And it's kind of like, after a while, she's like,
I think that he just, so from what I can understand is that he just kept them set up.
Oh, yes.
Because then he wouldn't have to take them down and set them up every time. That would be,
and it was often, would be
rough.
It was often.
Like,
so he
all right,
needed,
I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah. And so they, he would join him everywhere. Carpenter would for this
a little puppy dog.
Yes, just everywhere. And this plays into, the last days of Bob Crane's life. But yes, he would follow him around everywhere. And I mean, there were times where, like we mentioned earlier, I'm trying to keep this clean, it wasn't just Bob Crane and the girlfriends, but it was Bob Crane, the girlfriends, or the girls, and Carpenter, and everyone involved. And it was a very salacious lifestyle. It really was. I mean, he was a married man with children. This is what caused his first divorce. This was causing the second divorce. And I think he just sort of got lost in it.
Yeah. Patty would later say that, or even Bob would say that Patty thought that Bob was cheating on her. Now, this is what she's talking about, is she was fully, I mean, she wasn't just aware that he liked to step out. He was aware of the sex addiction. And so when we're talking about women that he would bring home a different woman every night, or whenever he was, it was different. And so the things that set the two affairs apart was that he continued to see these women, right, long term, and that was a no-no for Patty. Now, when he was lying to Annie about his affair with her, he would say, "I'm working late," and so he started working late for real. And Patty was like, "No, I don't believe it." And so she actually thought that he was having a continued affair with
a relationship, as opposed
to relationship,
yeah.
Instead of the stepping out. She was fine with if it was a different woman every night, but it was the possible new relationship that she was unwilling to accept.
Thanks guys so much for listening to our part 1 of Bob Crane's special. Please come back next week for our part 2, where we discuss the days leading up to his death, the circumstances under which he was found, the theories, the suspects, and the investigation, and also the ultimate court case that took place. Find us on havingballpod@gmail.com if you want to send us any information, suggestions, questions, comments. Having a Ball Podcast on Facebook, Having a Ball Pod on Instagram. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.